Hello, and to this episode of Table Topics, the Library Commission's virtual lecture series. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Ralph Didlake talking about UMMC's Asylum Hill Project. This is a fascinating topic, and I hope you'll all enjoy it. A little housekeeping throughout the presentation. If you have a question, instead of yelling out or whatever, just use the chat function at the end. If there's questions, then we'll loop back and we'll get all your questions answered. And that's really the only thing. Please mute yourself, or I can do it for you if you're not muted. Don't worry, I'll mute you. And anyway, so let me introduce Dr. Didlake, and then we'll get started. He's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UMMC. And he was appointed Chief Academic Officer in 2013. A native of New Mexico, Didlake is a graduate of the University of Mississippi and the University of Mississippi School of Medicine. He trained in general surgery at UMMC and later completed a surgical fellowship in organ transplantation at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. After practicing transplant, general, and vascular surgery for 23 years, Didlake developed an interest in the human context of modern medical and surgical care. This interest led him to pursue a master's degree in bioethics and health policy from Loyola University in Chicago. In 2008, he was appointed director of the UMMC's newly established Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities, a position he continues to hold. He is also professor of surgery. In his spare time, he enjoys restoring antique radios and has an interest in poetry criticism, especially 20th century Russian poets. He and his wife, Millie, are enjoying being grandparents. I like a well-rounded bio that's like technical stuff and the radios and the Russian poets. It's all there. So thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Didlake, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate being here. And thank you for that warm introduction. What all of that says is I have a bad case of attention deficit disorder is what that bio means. But I'm happy that we're here today to talk about the Asylum Hill Project. This has become the flagship project for our Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities. And I think it is an important project on many, many levels. Certainly for our center, certainly for the medical center writ large, but also for the state and the region. And I hope to make that case here in this presentation today. This topic always generates a lot of questions, so feel free to send a question into the chat because the give and take is important for us. Now I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Is that what I do right there?
Do you have the PowerPoint queued up?
I do not.
Oh, okay. Go ahead and cue that up.
Go ahead and queue up the PowerPoint. And how do I do that?
There you go.
I'm pulling up my PowerPoint here and just go to presentation and then it'll be there.
Go ahead and get your first slide put up.
My first slide. Okay.
For the, there you go.
All right.
And now share your screen and it'll be the right one.
Okay, I'll have to come out of this, go here, and share, where? Share. And then go here. Okay, we're there? Okay, great. We've solved the technical problems. Okay. To begin with, I'm sure everybody in Mississippi, most people in Mississippi would recognize this picture right here. This is the corner of North State Street and Woodrow Wilson here in Jackson, the location of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. But long before the medical center was even a concept, that corner was the home of this institution. Established in 1855, the Mississippi Lunatic Asylum, as it was officially founded, occupied that corner. it stayed there for 80 years. It closed in 1935 when that facility was replaced by the present Mississippi State Hospital at Whitfield. Now, over that period of time, it was the dominant architectural landmark of that part of Jackson and occupied an important part of the activity and history and goings on of Jackson. And over its history, it grew to be a very large facility. This is a 1925 insurance map showing all of the outbuildings. The picture you just saw was only this building right here, this so-called Kirkbride hospital building. But there were also many other outbuildings, other racially segregated wards, administrative buildings, a separate infirmary hospital facility, a large cow shed in the back. And it was of such a large size, it even had its own railroad spur from the main railroad line to bring supplies and coal and those sorts of things. So it was a huge operation. It's also important to note that the history of the asylum is very complicated. It wasn't simply an insane asylum. It was many other things. It was a hospital where people went who had head injuries, who had illnesses today that we wouldn't think of as mental illness, like epilepsy, and tuberculosis, and those sorts of things. So it served many healthcare functions. It's also important to note that it is well entrenched in Mississippi history. It was occupied by Union forces during the sieges of Jackson. It's highlighted in many of the histories of those sieges. So we have it very well entrenched in Mississippi history. It's also important to note that it wasn't just warehousing of the mentally ill. There were many operations going on there, like farming operations, in an effort for the facility to be at least partially self-sustaining. You can see here from the biennial reports that these were not small farming operations, both for vegetable production and livestock production. It was a going concern. It's also important to note that it wasn't just the corner of North State Street and Woodrow Wilson. It ultimately occupied some 1,300 acres in what is now Northeast Jackson, or Northwest Jackson, that was all state land, and part of it was farmed. It was a huge, all of this to say, it was a big operation and not just one thing. So the history of this enterprise is multi-layered, it's rich, it tells us a lot about ourselves, it tells us a lot about the period, even from its earliest days, as it was being constructed. Construction was actually delayed by some yellow fever outbreaks, another historical feature, and because of a couple of years of drought, the Pearl River was too low to float the logs down for the lumber to build the facility. So this is really intricately woven into the state's history. And again, it wasn't just warehousing. There was care going on here. As you can see from this list of the surgical support that was going on at the hospital. If you look at this from the 1927-29 biennial report, this list of surgical procedures represents what would be a normal surgical practice of the day. Same for dental care. There was dental care going on here. So all of this to point out that we're not talking about simply warehousing of the mentally ill. We're talking about a bona fide effort to care for these patients. Now, did the facility become overcrowded? Yes. Could it have used poor resources? Yes. But the history is richer than just warehousing of the mentally ill. We have learned a lot over the past couple of years about this rich history, and we continue to learn things day over day. As we entered this, we had no idea that there was a nursing school at the asylum. This may be one of the earliest nursing schools in the state. These were courtesy of one of the descendants of one of the hospital staff. This is probably one of the newer hospital buildings around 1919. So again, you can see this was a real facility, a real operational healthcare facility. This is probably the only extant photo of the interior of the asylum. Now, why is this now important? We're going to play you a video at this point that really highlights why the interest has been in the asylum has been renewed, at least on the part of the medical center. And it's going to introduce the Asylum Hill Project, and then we'll drill a little deeper into it after the video. The video will run about
11 minutes.
About 11 minutes. So Tracy, if you'll take it away.
In a quiet corner of the University of Mississippi Medical Center's campus stand headstones memorializing a handful of those who were once patients at the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum at some point during its 80-year history. Of the estimated 30,000 who once walked the halls at the former institution, about 10,000 took their last breath there. Many were also buried in the asylum cemetery on the grounds of what is now a bustling campus where thousands teach, learn, heal, and research every day. And who were the people who lived in this once hallowed institution? The Asylum Hill Project aims to find out.
When the State Lunatic Asylum closed in 1935, some of the outbuildings were maintained for state offices, but the cemetery at that point was no longer maintained.
In the early 1990s, a small number of remains and headstones were relocated to the campus cemetery. In 2012, workers unearthed another pine coffin in an area slated for construction.
As a roadway was being constructed, there was an effort to determine the size of the cemetery. So formal cultural resource surveys were done.
Everyone sort of understood that there was a large cemetery, but they never really understood the number of individuals that were likely buried here. What we did was we ran a gradiometer, which is in essence, a very expensive metal detector.
It was at that time that the magnitude of the cemetery was really revealed.
In 2013 and 14, 66 burials were exhumed by archaeological teams and are currently housed at the Mississippi State University Cobb Institute of Archaeology.
These burials are unmarked, but we have a record of who was at the facility, we have a record of who died at the facility, and we have a record of who was buried, at least post-1912, of who was buried at the asylum cemetery.
As the project became a little more publicly known, or the proposal, we got a lot of interest from the press, and that generated interest in the community from descendants who had lots of questions.
But all I do know for certain is what my grandmother said. She was buried in Jackson. Now, at that time, she didn't know where exactly. She didn't know that she was buried on the hospital grounds.
These burials appeared to be roughly in a series of rows and fairly well organized, that they were equally spaced and all aligned and oriented the same way. And so it seemed like a very structured cemetery.
The Asylum Hill Project is an effort to manage a very large cemetery on the grounds of the University of Mississippi Medical Center that occupies the last undeveloped land on the campus. Our critical needs for care of our current and future patients demand that we build on that space. We have inherited these patients from the asylum. So we have a responsibility not just to manage them respectfully, but there's a continuity of care issue here. I think our ethical obligation is a little higher because we are a healthcare institution. That's what we do.
In its 1857 report to the legislature, the Board of Trustees of the asylum praised the new institution as a place of refuge and renewal, a realm of its own, a mansion peculiar to itself, and, quoting Shakespeare, a place to raise out the written troubles of the brain. This realm of its own, while the first one of its kind in the South, did have precedent. Thomas Kirkbride, the internationally respected Philadelphia physician, had pioneered an architectural and organizational plan that would standardize the care for the mentally ill. On January 10, 1855, the very first patient walked up the steps, through the columns, and into the asylum. She was a 29-year-old married woman from Copiah County. She died 35 years, 3 months, and 23 days later. Her diagnosis, mania.
An important part of the asylum's history is that it spanned a period of bioscience and biomedical discovery. So as more conditions were identified as being really medical conditions with psychiatric manifestations, today we would not consider them mental illness. But at that time, given the level of medical knowledge, they would have been madness of some sort.
In 1857, conditions that might lead to admission to the asylum included hereditary tendencies, domestic troubles, love, military ambition, or religious excitement.
Things that we would not hospitalize people in mental institutions for today, where they would be treated medically, like epilepsy or what we would now think is situational depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. So all of those patients are in this mix in the asylum. The descendants have played a really important role in the development of our thinking and the development of the project. They are the holders of the memories, so we need to connect with them and get as many stories and documents and information about these folks as we possibly can. We also want to help them close emotional loops if we can.
But I would like to know what it was like for her when she was a patient here. What treatments did she undergo, if any, while she was here?
What we've learned about the asylum thus far is that it was a complex institution and was not just one thing, either across time or really at any one time. It was a place where people sent people with mental illness to get better.
And we have information about those individuals. It's not just their name. We've got, how old they were, where they were from, what they died of, what they were admitted for, and those sorts of pieces of information are critical to our understanding and interpretation of not just the cemetery, but the institution of Mississippi.
My great-grandmother, her name was Zenny.
Her husband came to the asylum to visit, but he didn't come a lot because really and truly it would upset her.
I'm guessing that he didn't think that she was gonna be admitted for long. She would be treated and, he would check her out or she would be dismissed and he'd bring her back home. How she ended up here was that she had a mental breakdown. And I guess at that time, you know, it was recommended that he have her committed. And she had a brother who told my great grandfather, "You need to go get her, you know, go get Zenny." And he said, "Every time I go, it looks like she gets farther and farther away."
Zenny G was admitted to the asylum in August of 1920. She died 1 year, 3 days later at age 60 of heart disease. According to her death certificate, she is among those who were buried in the hospital cemetery. In its very first year, the asylum housed 155 patients. By the mid-1920s, it was severely overcrowded with more than 2,000 on the rolls. Legislation for the new facility was passed in 1926, but political wrangling, the 1927 flood, budget constraints, and the Great Depression would delay the opening of the new facility for a full 8 years. The hospital's March 1935 move to Rankin County marked the end of an era for the asylum and its patients. But its legacy, and the legacy of its patients in the story of Mississippi, is one that must be preserved.
The historical position of the asylum from 1855 to 1935 positions it right over a critically important era in Mississippi history. Actually, multiple critically important eras in Mississippi. It spanned the antebellum period. It was present and active during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow South, during the period where medicine emerged from a trade to a profession. It also spanned the period where psychiatry became an independent professional discipline. So the history of the asylum has a lot to teach us about all of those eras of history and what role did mental health, public institutions, cultural standards, all of those things are platforms to learn more about the history, and as history does so well, to teach us more about ourselves.
Oh, we are happy to be involved with the Asylum Hill Project because now we know what happened to her. You know, think this was a mystery, you know, of our family for the most part. And when you think about it, mental health is not something that's readily talked about. So to have that, plus to know that, for all we knew, she was just buried here in Jackson somewhere. We didn't even know where. So at least now we know where she is buried. This has given my family, on my grandmother's side at least, closure.
Let me pick up with why this has become an issue now. During the operation, the 80-year operation of the lunatic asylum, this was a period where many patients were abandoned by their families there. Transportation was not what it is today. Embalming practices, funereal practices, not what they are today. So the asylum operated a very large cemetery on its campus. In the 30-year period between the closure of the asylum and the building of the medical center, that cemetery was derelict. It was not maintained. It was essentially forgotten about. Over the years of operation in the 20th century of the medical center, it was known that there was a cemetery up there on the hill, but it was way away from any activity on the campus, and it was out of sight, out of mind. As the campus began to grow, however, occasional construction projects would unearth a burial site, and we would re-inter that individual on our campus. but it was not a big deal. It became a big deal when we wanted to build a new parking garage adjacent to our dental school and plan for some much larger construction projects, such as the new children's hospital that will be opening next month. So it was decided to do formal cultural resource surveys to determine the size of the cemetery. So a team of archaeologists from Mississippi State and Ole Miss came down and did a formal cultural survey and told us that there are as many as 7,000 burials that occupy the last undeveloped land on our campus. Now, that presents us with multiple challenges for lots of reasons. These are people. This is not just historical artifact. And it's not just that they are people, they are Mississippians that really tell many, many stories. For example, this is John Whitfield. In some records, he's listed as Whitfield, but in his family lore, it was told that he was a farmer in Kentucky, struggling to get along in the early part of the 20th century. He heard a story that a young man could come to the Mississippi Delta and farm cotton and get rich. So he moved his young family to the Delta. It was 1928. A couple of years later, the bottom falls out of the market. And as the family story continues, he would feed his family first before he would eat. He developed a vitamin deficiency, pellagra, which has neuropsychiatric manifestations. And he was admitted to the asylum for treatment of that. Now, consider another story. Nathan Stature, a freedman who had some sort of domestic trouble and got admitted to the asylum and stayed there almost 40 years until he was killed by one of the livestock in the livestock operation there on campus. A completely different narrative, a completely different background, a different road leading to the asylum, but still part of our history. And poignantly on this particular, for Nathan's particular situation, on his death certificate, there's no family listed, as was true for many of the freedmen of the time. But here is his admission record to the asylum. Now, contrast these two stories to this one, to Polly Chamberlain. Polly was born into the elite planter class of Mississippi. Her mother and father were wealthy planters down in Southwest Mississippi. Her father died young, leaving her mother a rich widow. She remarried a physician and planter in the Lorman area, and again was in this privileged elite planter class. Then her mother dies. Polly, educated and a poet, fell into a deep depression and was ultimately admitted to the asylum with the very poignant, I think, diagnosis of grief. Now, what do these three stories, these three very disparate stories, have in common? Polly and Nathan and John are all buried in the asylum cemetery. Now, that history now collides with the present. The University Medical Center is the state's only safety net hospital. It's the only level 1 trauma center in the state. It's the only transplant program in the state. It manages 1 million patient encounters a year. 1 million patient encounters a year. It now is not just a medical school and teaching hospital. It is 6 hospitals and 6 schools. School of Nursing and Dentistry and a graduate school, population health, pharmacy. It is a big operation. The institution has obligations to its current and future patients to grow and meet the demands of those current and future patients. So here we sit at the corner of North State and Woodrow Wilson, and this green space right here is the last undeveloped land on our campus. This is where there are 7,000 burials, extending from right here at the back of the VA hospital, extending to Lakeland Drive, and from the developed edge of our campus to St. Dominic's. Okay, so here we are facing that issue. How do we manage this? How do we manage this in a responsible way to meet our obligations to our current and future patients, to be respectful of the individuals interred in this cemetery, to handle the issue ethically, and also understand that this history and these remains are of important historical and scientific value. So here is the plan that the Asylum Hill Project has brought forward to manage this difficult and challenging situation. We have proposed to exhume the remains and individually curate them using modern archaeological standards, individually boxed and cataloged and state-of-the-art long-term storage containers. Place those remains in a respectful memorial structure. Not reinter them, but put them in a memorial structure, like sort of an ossuary type approach that is common in Europe. But do this in a way where we can leverage the scientific value of those remains and the research opportunities they present. We also want to leverage the educational opportunities that the project brings forward. Now, for us at the Medical Center, this represents all of our missions. We have a mission to care, to provide clinical care. And we have, in a very tangible way, inherited these patients. So therefore, for us, there's a continuity of care issue. We are also a research institution. We have an obligation to recognize and execute on research opportunities. We are also an education institution, and this project would allow us to bring forward some very unique education opportunities. Now, you can instantly see the challenges here. There's the administrative challenge of a very large project. Can we do this ethically? What is financially the best approach? To replace this land would cost approximately $16 million. The Asylum Hill Project we can do for probably $4 million. Do we have the legal standing to do what we're proposing? What are our historical obligations to preserve this history? And what can we learn scientifically? What can we do educationally? And what can we do that's culturally appropriate for our state and region? So to answer these challenges, we put together a group that we refer to as the Asylum Hill Research Consortium. And it consists of all of the disciplines you see listed here. because this project cuts across all of the disciplines that you would ever expect in a historical type project. Happily, we have been able to bring together content experts in all of these areas to serve on the consortium and advise the project to meet all of those challenges that I listed. This project cuts across a lot of institutions. We have members from almost all of the IHL institutions, plus others out of the state, such as Texas State University that has an ancient DNA lab, and Idaho State University that wants to partner with University of Southern Mississippi to build a physical archive of the coffin material to study, to do paleo-environmental work and help us date the burial sites. So where do we stand in this project? We've divided it into 3 phases. The first phase is to form the consortium, find the content experts that can help us do this, create our research protocols. We have secured archival space for the interim storage of human remains as we gather the funds to build the memorial structure. And this picture at the top here is part of that archival space that the medical center maintains at the farmers market space. We have started developing searchable databases, so all of the information about the patients and the project will be accessible by appropriately vetted scholars. We've also started outreach to the community to engage all of the descendants of the staff and patients that we possibly can, so we could gather stories, so we can gather artifacts, pictures and documents, and make the community deeply engaged in this process. And we are pursuing grant funding. I'm happy to report that we have a substantial grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, about $250,000, to develop the historical part. We haven't secured money to start excavation yet, but we have secured money for that part. Phase 2 will be the actual exhumation of the burial sites. We will hire our own bioarchaeologist on faculty here at the medical center, and their job will be to lead the recovery of the burial sites and the curation of the remains. As part of that, we will establish field schools that will allow archaeology and anthropology students from all over the country to come in and learn how to do this at the state of the art. Phase 2 will also include additional engagement of the descendants, expansion of our databases, and for the purposes of meeting the needs of our future patients, it will make this land available for future construction projects to, I guess, manage the next pandemic that we have. Phase 3 will be a separate fundraising effort to build a permanent memorial laboratory where these remains can reside, and we can engage in collaborative study of the remains with carefully vetted scholars. And now, it's important to pause at this point and remind everyone that these burial sites are unmarked. We know who is buried there, but we cannot connect a name to a set of remains. So if we ever get to the point where we do identify a set of remains, we will work out protocols to make those remains available to a family, a descendant, if they want to inter them in a more conventional manner. And of course, we do have long-term plans for public programming and educational programs. So with that, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions through the chat. And I also encourage anyone who is listening, who is a descendant of a staff person or a patient or knows of a descendant, we would be happy to enter them into our database and archive any materials that they may have. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and go to here. And how do I go back? And that I see Lida on the screen, but
we see I can see everyone. It might be how your view at the top right corner.
okay, great.
And it looks like we're just going to post a link to that video since we were having troubles today. And we'll post that with the our master editor Elizabeth is going to cut out that section for the YouTube audience, so they will not see the hey, is it playing? Nope. Oh, okay. There aren't any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone has one, go ahead and ask. While I ask, on the map that showed where the asylum originally extended, it looked like it was over 55, like what would have eventually become 55, and over here where the Library Commission is in the R&D Center.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I don't know that I have, that's something that just before the pandemic hit, I was able to do a little bit of research on exactly where the property was. There is a very good, and I'm sorry, Dr. Didlake, I didn't mean to just take over, but I also know I haven't had a chance to really share this as much with him as I could have if we had not been occupied by other things for the past 6 months. But there's a very clear description of the property because in 1932, a woman who was from out of state put several oil wells on the site. And so, and there was an agreement that if she hit oil, that much of that would go back to this, much of the money would go back to the state. There was some agreement with that. So there's a very clear legal description that if anybody knows anybody who could like give us the actual outline based on this legal description, that would be great. But when you saw the slide that Dr. Didlake showed with the sections highlighted, from what I could tell as a layperson reading this, it was a portion of each of those. But yes, it started out as 140 acres in 1935. I mean, in 1855. By 1935, it was 1,300 acres. And I believe, based on my reading, it certainly included all of what is now LaFleur's Bluff, where the Natural Science Museum is, all the way down to Mays Lake, all the way down to the river. Most of what was then public land and is still now public land, the Library Commission is, where the R&D Center is, and all the way to the Pearl. So it was a huge operation.
That really is. We have some questions in the chat now. Do you have a breakdown of how many individuals are buried from each county?
Oh, that's a great question. We are working on developing that database. We are in the process of gathering and collating all of those records. Now, in the days of digital, we forget that these are handwritten records. And in our early efforts to digitize these and transcribe these records, it's been a fascinating undertaking because we have incorporated some of our medical students into that effort. And they are very willing research workers, but they don't know cursive writing. And they certainly don't know the cursive script of that era. And you'll see them pulling things up on their cell phones and saying, is this an S or is that an R? So it's a fascinating undertaking, but we are in the process of developing exactly that kind of database. Now, there are many things that we can learn from that. If we study the remains properly and look at isotopic analyses and those sorts of things, we can tell a lot about the nutrition of the state. We can do paleopharmacological studies. So there's lots of things to be learned about using geographic distribution, gender distribution, racial distribution, all of those things. That's exactly where we want to head.
Okay.
If I could say something too, I put a link here, and Dr. Didlake, I'm sorry to take over yet again. I'm about to leave and do a presentation on this. From 1912 to 1935, in 1912, the state began keeping death certificates. So from 1912 to 1935, we have information about who is buried at the asylum. And that comes from the original death certificates, which were carefully and painstakingly transcribed by a volunteer at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History named Nan Harvey. And that information, so if you perhaps had a relative that you think might be buried at the asylum and might have died between 1912 and 1935, you can go and look that up on the MDAH's website, and I have included the link here in the notes.
And I think that answered one of the questions that was in the chat. Will there be access to for individuals to this information? So that's one step of it if they were between those years. But any other, what will be the public access be to the
that's a really important question, especially from a bioethics standpoint. We want to be respectful of these individuals. And if we learn about their experience, what can we ethically share and what would that process look like? We are working through those protocols now. There's legal features, there's HIPAA features, there's ethical features. We want to do this exactly right and walk that thin line of shared scholarship and respect for these individuals.
Someone has asked, are there records of what the patients died from?
Yes, there are, and that information is available really from two sources. There are logs kept by the asylum, just physical handwritten records that record date of death and cause. And then, as Lyda said, after 1912, there's an official death certificate that lists cause.
And how many family members have you found through the outreach efforts to locate descendants?
Okay, Lyda is the descendant wrangler.
So over 100. I'm not sure, I need to, that's one thing on my list of things to do as we sort of get back into focusing a little more on this project after having been occupied by other things for the past 6 months. So over 100 though. And it's interesting, I will note this, that we have at least one patient there, and we've had correspondence from descendants who don't even know each other, which is also interesting. So, you know, so they have different stories about, or different stories that have been handed down through their different parts of the family tree.
Okay. Any other questions? If you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself at this time.
While we're waiting for the next question, we have had a lot of community partners in the development of this project thus far. Department of Archives and History has been a solid partner. The Mississippi Humanities Council, the Mississippi Library Commission has been a great partner in this. Millsaps College, two faculty from over there, Amy Forbes and Patrick Hopkins, are actually members of the Center for Bioethics faculty as well, and they have been important partners here. Lyda, there's the support for the video link. Could you remind us of those players?
Yes, of course. So the video that gives a little bit of an overview and gives some of the information that Dr. Didlake has given today, but also has additional information about the archaeological work the limited archaeological work that has already been done. And that was done, this short video, 11 minutes, was done with support from the Mississippi Humanities Council and also some additional support from Millsaps College.
I don't see any other questions. Anyone else have anything?
Well, let me repeat that we are happy to talk to any descendant. We're happy to talk to anyone because community engagement, as you might imagine, is an important feature of this. Cemeteries are sensitive subjects, and we want to handle this responsibly at every level. So community engagement is really important for us. But if you're a descendant or know a descendant of staff or patient, we would love to talk to them and gather their stories.
Someone asked if they can share the links and all the information on their library's Facebook page. I'm going to guess the answer is yes.
It's an enthusiastic yes.
What we'll do now that we have a little more information and we have these great links, we'll not only just post a post on our Facebook page, but we'll do a blog post as well, and then we'll share that on all of our social media. And I think a story like this, every once in a while, reminding people that it's going on. You know, you hit different people at different times. We have another librarian saying like they can see great library programming about this topic.
We love visiting libraries either virtually or biologically. We will be happy to come tell this story.
And Dr. Didlake, let me add too that part of our recent $250,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities provides for travel all over the state, and we would love to partner with libraries all over the state in trying to attract descendants from those areas to tell their stories if they'd like, or to come hear more about what life was like at the asylum. And that will be, and then that's a project over the next 3 years, but we hope to get some traveling in the works, perhaps by the spring and certainly by next summer.
We had one more comment in the chat. Someone has said, I'm hoping that a book will result from this effort in the future. Thanks for the presentation and for the kind and respectful way in which these investigations are taking place. And this person was a psychiatrist at Whitfield for about 13 years.
Excellent. Well, I deeply appreciate that comment. And part of the deliverables for the NEH grant will be a monograph history of the asylum and an anthology about the project. So yes.
Well, we will make sure we get that monograph in libraries and therefore available across the state.
Okay.
All right. Well, if you have any additional questions, you can send them to the Library Commission and we will get them to Dr. Didlake and Lyda and get your answers at the ready. And thank you to everyone who came today. Thank you for your patience with our multiple technical difficulties. And again, thank you, Dr. Didlake, for coming to your office to talk to talk about this really important and fascinating project.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Deeply appreciated.
Hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.